And now Hans Niemann, rook takes g7 on the board. In this video, I'm showing you how Hans Niemann just destroyed Leinier Dominguez in round number 3 of the United States Chess Championships using his favorite Italian opening as white. Now in the game, Hans Niemann is playing as white. He opens 1e4 best by test, Leinier Dominguez goes e5, and then knight f3, knight c6, and 3, bishop c4 on the board. This is the Italian opening, and this is one of Hans Niemann's absolute favorite openings to play as white. He prefers this over the traditional Ruy Lopez move with 3 bishop b5. And now Leinier Dominguez goes for one of the absolute main lines of the Italian opening as black. He starts bishop c5, a very standard developing move. Hans Niemann castles, then knight to f6, challenges the pawn on e4 of Hans Niemann, and Hans Niemann defends, d3 on the board supporting the pawn. Now from here, both sides again continue down the main line of this opening. d6 for Leinier Dominguez, Hans Niemann goes c3, supporting a future d4 break potentially. Leinier Dominguez castles, and then Hans Niemann rook to e1, a very standard developing move. Now in this position, black does have to make a choice. The main lines for the Italian for black are going to include either bishop e6 immediately, or a5, or a6. And all of them have their own pros and cons. They're all very, very playable. In the game, Leinier Dominguez goes for the move a5, expanding on the queen side. This move is very double-edged. On the one hand, you do gain more space and clamp down on a future b4 break from white. So now, b4, simply not a possibility. That loses a pawn on the spot. However, the drawback of this move is it does weaken the b5 square, and we're going to see in the future, Hans Niemann may want to go bishop b5, try to put pressure on that knight on c6. Of course, the knight on c6 does control the d4 square, and if that knight is removed, the d4 becomes that much stronger for Hans Niemann. So now here, both sides again continue down the absolute main line of this variation with a5 in the Italian opening. Here Hans Niemann h3, guarding the g4 square, stopping future knight g4 ideas. Leinier Dominguez does the same, h6, stopping bishop g5 ideas from Hans Niemann. And now Hans, knight d2. This is one of the last preparatory moves. And here, Leinier Dominguez plays the very strong idea, bishop e6, challenging Hans Niemann's bishop on c4. Now, of course, Hans Niemann does have the option of going bishop takes e6 here. However, after bishop takes f takes, black is doing perfectly fine. So instead, Hans Niemann plays the main move here, bishop b5, challenging the knight on the c6 square, and again, capitalizing on the weakness of the b5 square, that weakness being created by Leinier Dominguez's move a5, expanding on the queen side. Now here, this is one of the absolute main positions of the Italian opening with the move a5 on the board, and here black has a wide variety of options. Real fast, the main moves for black include bishop b6, bishop a7, knight d7, and queen b8. In the game, Leinier Dominguez goes for the move bishop b6. Now, the idea behind this move is Hans Niemann is threatening d4 at some point, so he's trying to get the bishop off the c5 square where it would be hit with tempo at the move d4. So, very, very solid idea, and Leinier Dominguez's future ideas may include knight to e7 and knight g6, or even knight to h5, and then queen to f6, trying to drum some sort of attack on the king side. Now, here, Hans Niemann, the main move for him is going to be knight to f1. That's the standard Italian and Ruy Lopez rerouting of the knight. You're trying to get the knight to the g3 square where it supports e4, and then you break in the center with d4. But instead, in this game, Hans Niemann has a completely different idea in mind. Here, he goes knight to c4. The idea being the bishop just wasted a tempo going bishop c5 to b6, and now Hans Niemann immediately challenges the bishop again. If Leinier Dominguez does nothing, then knight takes b6 is going to win the bishop pair and ruin black's pawn structure. So, of course, Leinier Dominguez, he has to do something here to stop that threat. In the game, he actually goes bishop c5, a very interesting move. Here, Leinier Dominguez, he wasted a tempo going bishop b6, then another bishop c5. Well, not wasted a tempo, but he spent a tempo doing that. So, here, Hans Niemann, he actually has the option of going for a draw with the move knight d2. For example, knight d2, bishop b6, knight c4, bishop c5. That would simply be a draw by repetition, but of course Hans Niemann in this game, he's playing for a win. He doesn't do that. Instead here, after bishop c5, he goes bishop a4. A very curious move, but the idea being he potentially wants to reroute the bishop back to the c2 square where it does support this pawn on e4, and it may help his attack on the king side with the bishop being on this very powerful diagonal here. Now, of course, the drawback of this move bishop a4 is it doesn't do a whole lot immediately, and here Leinier Dominguez, he can decide what he wants to do in this position. For example, he has a wide variety of moves. Queen to b8, threatening b5 is very playable. Knight to e7 is very playable. That's kind of the standard idea for black in the Italian opening in these a5 positions. But instead here, Leinier Dominguez plays a very committal move. Bishop takes c4. He's giving up the bishop for the knight on the c4 square in order to damage white's pawn structure after the move d takes c4. Now, Hikaru himself said this move is a little bit sketchy for black. You do give up the bishop pair, and it's not really clear if these pawns on the queen side are actually weak. For example, yes, they are doubled, but this pawn on c4 does stop the b5 and d5 breaks from black, and this pawn on c3 does do a very good job of controlling the d4 square, so knight d4 is now not a possibility. So it's not really clear if these pawns are a weakness, and now Hans Niemann has the bishop pair essentially for free. So what is Leinier Dominguez going to do next to try and hold this position? In the game, he goes knight to h5, and I checked the database. There's only one move in the database with this move, and it was an email game, so this is an over-the-board novelty. Instead, knight to h7 was the only move played in over-the-board practice by grandmasters, but instead, knight h5 on the board, and we essentially have a brand new position on move 13 in the Italian. Now, what does Hans Niemann do in response to Leinier Dominguez's opening novelty? Well, if you follow Hans Niemann's games, you know he is a very aggressive attacking player. It's one of the reasons he's my favorite chess player. And in this position, he goes for it on the king side with a series of very aggressive moves. He expands with the move g4, knocking back the knight immediately. The knight goes back to the f6 square, and then Hans Niemann g5 on the board, forcing h takes g6, and then bishop takes. So h takes, and then bishop takes on the board. And here Hans Niemann, he's essentially committing himself to attacking on the king side. And now I do want to point out, the computer technically doesn't love this idea of g4 to g5. However, in a practical over-the-board game, when you're in a new position without computer preparation, this is a very, very dangerous idea, and it worked out incredibly well for Hans Niemann in this game. All right, here, Leinier Dominguez, what should he be doing? Well, he has to be thinking about Hans Niemann's attacking ideas. Of course, Hans Niemann may be threatening to push the h-pawn up the board in the future, and he can also threaten doubling rooks on the g-file. So, with that in mind, how is he going to defend against these threats? Now, real fast, if you're enjoying this video, please smash that YouTube like button right now. It helps me out so much. Thank you so much for doing that. Now, back to the game. In the game, he goes queen to c8, trying to get his queen out of the pin of the bishop to the knight. Of course, this does allow Hans Niemann to immediately go bishop takes f6, trying to damage black's pawn structure on the king side. He would have double pawns on the f-file, and those pawns would be very useless. However, that move does not work, because here Leinier Dominguez has the intermediate move queen takes h3, and it turns out if white goes bishop takes f6 and Leinier Dominguez responds queen takes h3, black is the one attacking white, and black gets a very good position. So with that in mind, what does Hans Niemann do here? He finds the best move, simply king to h2, defending the pawn on the h3 square. Now, of course, queen takes h3 is not a threat, and Hans Niemann is threatening bishop takes f6, damaging black's pawn structure. So black has to respond here. What does Leinier Dominguez do? He responds knight to h7, retreating the knight and putting the pressure on the bishop. Not a bad move at all. But here Hans Niemann, instead of retreating, say, bishop e3 or bishop d2 or bishop c1, instead here, as usual, Hans Niemann plays a much more aggressive and much stronger idea, rook to g1. Supporting the bishop with the rook, he's willing to give up his bishop pair in this position in order to get attacking chances on the king side immediately. So, Leinier Dominguez, what should he be doing? Well, first of all, knight takes g5 is not a particularly good move. Hans Niemann would respond rook takes g5, and the rook is very strong on the g-file. He could then follow up, say, queen d2, rook a to g1, and he'd have a very aggressive attacking position, and it's not clear if black could hold on there. Instead here, Leinier Dominguez finds a much stronger idea, simply queen to e6, trying to centralize the queen and defending with the queen along the 6th rank. So, very good idea. Now Hans Niemann, what should he be doing? He decides the most important thing in this position is immediately doubling rooks on the g-file. He goes rook g2, preparing doubling rooks with rook a to g1 in the future, and also defending the pawn on the f2 square. Of course, that pawn on f2 was being attacked, but Hans Niemann understood doubling rooks immediately is the most important thing in this kind of position. Now, Leinier Dominguez, what should he be doing once again? Well, it turns out he has the option of going knight takes g5, and this move is a little bit stronger here than it was a move prior, because Hans Niemann went rook to g2, so now knight takes g5 forces the rook to move again. Hans Niemann essentially wasting a tempo versus the prior variation with the immediate knight takes g5. But instead, he doesn't do that. He simply retreats the knight, the very standard Italian move, knight to e7 on the board, trying to reroute the knight closer to the king side and getting it out of the attack of the bishop on the a4 square. Now here, Hans Niemann, he goes bishop d2, This is a very interesting move. Here's why he did it. If instead he went, say, queen d2 or something like that, trying to double up rooks on the g-file immediately, then black is going to have the option of f6, the Ben Feingold counterattack, and here the bishop may be partially trapped. Yes, you can retreat it to h4, but it's not a very good square for the bishop. Yes, you can go bishop e3, but again, that allows black to trade off one more attacking piece of Hans Niemann, so that wouldn't be as attractive. Instead, he simply goes bishop d2, retreating the bishop, and here his idea is going to be queen to e2, and then rook a to g1, trying to double up those rooks on the g-file and pressuring the weak g7 point. And in addition to all of this, of course, Leinier Dominguez no longer having the option of knight takes g5, trying to remove one more attacking piece of Hans Niemann. So very good multi-purpose move, bishop d2 by Hans Niemann. Now here, Leinier Dominguez, knight to g6 on the board, bringing the knight over to the king side and trying to clog up the g-file, but Hans Niemann is not amused. He just continues with his plan, starting with queen to e2, again the idea being rook a to g1 in the future. Now Leinier Dominguez, queen to f6 on the board, his idea being he wants to go knight to f4 potentially, hitting the rook and the queen on the e2 and g2 squares, and here by going queen to f6 before going knight to f4, if white takes on f4 with the bishop, he can recapture with the queen. So of course, if he went knight to f4 immediately, that is playable, but white has the idea of bishop takes f4 and then rook a to g1, and black's going to have those weak double pawns on the f-file. So instead, queen to f6 on the board right away for Leinier Dominguez, setting up knight to f4 threats. Now here Hans Niemann, he spots the threat, he goes rook to g4. This is a very, very strong move. The idea being now, once again, if black goes knight to f4, then you take back with the bishop immediately, and queen takes f4 is not a possibility. Instead, he has to recapture with the pawn, and again, that is going to weaken his pawn structure. And beyond that, rook g4, getting out of future knight f4 ideas, of course, the rook won't be attacked. So Hans Niemann, very good, very flexible move. Now here, Leinier Dominguez, he goes c6 in this position, a very standard idea in this a5 line of the Italian opening. Here, b5 is not really a threat, so instead, the main idea of this move is potentially going bishop b6, and then bishop c7 or bishop d8, trying to reroute the bishop over to the king side where it can defend. So a decent waiting move, but overall, Leinier Dominguez, he really doesn't have many active plans in this position, so this move c6 is very telling. He's kind of telling Hans Niemann, there's not much I can do, so I'm going to sit around and wait while you slowly build up the attack, and that is exactly what Hans Niemann does. He starts rook a to g1, doubling up the rooks on the g-file. Of course, there's going to be all sorts of rook takes g6 or rook takes g7 threats in the future. Now, Leinier Dominguez, king to h8, a good defensive move. It's getting the king off the open g-file and setting up rook g8 ideas where the rook will further support that g7 pawn, which is one of the big weaknesses in his position. Now, Hans Niemann, bishop c2, a very strong idea. The idea being if this e-pawn is ever removed, if black ever goes d5 or something like that, this bishop may be stronger on this diagonal where it does put pressure on those g6 and h7 squares. Now Leinier, bishop b6, again the standard idea in the Italian opening with a5, trying to reroute the bishop, and now Hans Niemann, rook 1 g2. And this is sort of a waiting move. Hans Niemann had the option of playing the immediate h4, trying to ram the h-pawn down the board, but Hans Niemann just biding his time. He's not in a rush here. Now Leinier Dominguez, bishop d8, and this turns out to be a very weak move. The problem with this is it blocks the rook on the a8 square from getting into the game. And this is just premature. The bishop on d8 is not doing anything helpful immediately to help his defensive task. And here Hans Niemann, he has the option of going h4 immediately, trying to crash through on the king side. Instead here, before doing that, he plays one last preparatory move, a very strong idea, c5, expanding on the queen side. The idea behind this move is potentially if black takes on c5, as he did in the game, d takes c5 on the board. You don't want to allow c takes d6. Here, Hans Niemann in the future is going to have the additional option of bishop b3, rerouting the Italian opening bishop to this very strong diagonal. So Hans Niemann playing a very flexible move, giving up one pawn in return for increased attacking chances in the future. Now here, Hans Niemann, he finally crashes through on the king side, or starts to crash through with the key idea h4. His idea being, of course, just try to ram that h-pawn down the board as a battering ram. Now here real fast, knight takes h4 does not work. Hans Niemann obviously just recaptures with the knight or the rook, and the queen cannot take, you lose the queen. So h4 to h5 is a very serious threat, and there's not a whole lot Leinier Dominguez can do to stop it in this Italian opening. Now in the game, he goes c4, This is actually a pretty solid move. The idea being he's trying to take control of that b3 square and stop future bishop b3 ideas from Hans Niemann. But Hans, he's not amused. He goes h5, immediately putting pressure on that knight on g6. The knight is going to have to move, and then he's going to have the option of rook takes g7 next. We'll have to see if he does that. So, knight e7 on the board, and here Hans Niemann, he goes for the kill shot. Rook takes g7, taking the pawn on g7, and he's willing to give up those 2 rooks for the queen if black takes on g7 with the queen. Now, queen takes g7 would not be a good move. Obviously, Hans Niemann takes the queen with the rook, the king takes, and then without that queen, Hans Niemann's attacking chances are just too much. Obviously, the bishop on d8 and the rook on a8 for black are going to be out of the game for a very, very long time. So instead, after rook takes g7, here at Leinier Dominguez, he has to just eat it. He has to allow Hans Niemann to take the pawn for free, and he goes rook to g8, trying to defend on the g-file. Now, rook takes g8 is a very playable move. There's also the insane-looking move rook takes h7, but instead of those complicated variations, here Hans Niemann, he stays cool, calm, and collected. He goes rook 7, g3, a very simple move. The idea being if Leinier Dominguez takes on g3 with the rook, rook takes g3, then Hans Niemann takes back with the f-pawn, and suddenly he has the open f-file to attack with, and he has those 2 pawns on g3 and h5 that are going to be battering rams in the black position. So, with that being said, rook takes g3 was not the move by Leinier Dominguez. That'd be a little bit weaker. Instead, he goes b5, expanding on the queen side and trying to defend the pawn on c4. So, not a bad idea at all, but obviously, it does not do anything to help the defense of the king side. And here Hans Niemann, he finds the strongest idea, as usual, knight to g5 on the board, jumping in with the knight. Hans Niemann is trying to remove some of the defenders of black's king side, especially that knight on the h7 square. Here the threat is simply knight takes h7, and what is Leinier Dominguez going to do about this threat in the Italian opening? In the game, he goes knight takes g5, a decent move. Instead, if you do something like rook to g7, I do want to show this real fast, rook g7, then the threat is going to be rook to f3, and that queen on f6 is nearly trapped, almost no matter where it goes. For example, queen d6 or queen to h6, then the move is going to be knight takes f7, forking the king and the queen. That's going to be an absolute disaster. Now, instead of rook g7, Leinier Dominguez, in the game, he opts for the other idea of simply knight takes g5, knocking off the knight immediately. So, knight takes g5 on the board, then Hans Niemann takes back with the bishop, hitting the queen and pressuring the knight on e7 behind it. Now, the queen has to move. Leinier Dominguez goes queen to e6 in the game, and then Hans Niemann, he slowly increases the pressure, queen to f3, a very good move. And yes, there were other moves available. For example, queen e3 and queen e2 were also very strong. But Hans Niemann, his threat here is going to be bishop to f6, hitting the king and opening up the g-file for the rook. So, very simple, very strong idea. Now here, Leinier Dominguez, he makes one of his last mistakes of the game. In the game, the best move is going to be king to h7, trying to get the king off this diagonal where the bishop can't hit it with check. But instead, he goes knight to c8 in this position, and this turns out to be a very, very weak move. Here, Hans Niemann, he just goes bishop f6 all the same, and the idea being, if you take the bishop with either the bishop or the queen, then rook takes g8 is going to win the rook. So Hans Niemann crashing through here in this crazy Italian game. Here, bishop takes f6 is the move. Obviously, queen takes would not work, because then rook takes g8 is just deadly. So, bishop takes f6 on the board, then rook takes g8, king to h7 is forced, and here Hans Niemann, he plays an absolutely stunning move to finish the game. Rook to e8. Now, the idea behind this move is if you take the rook with the queen, then queen to f5 is going to lead to an immediate checkmate. But if he doesn't do that, then Hans Niemann will continue piling up the pressure, say rook g8, and the game's going to be over one way or another. And here, real fast, this is the finish. If Leinier Dominguez were to take on e8, queen takes e8, then the checkmate is queen to f5, hitting the king to h6, queen takes f6, and then after king takes h5 or king to h7, either way, it's going to be checkmate in one move. For example, queen to g7, checkmate. And for that reason, after the stunning move, rook to e8 from Hans Niemann, Leinier Dominguez resigns on the spot to Hans Niemann and his unstoppable Italian opening. Wow, what a game. Now, Chess YouTube, before you go, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, check out this video right here featuring 5 of the best games from the Magnus Carlsen versus Hans Niemann match at the Speed Chess Championships. I'm sure you're going to love it. It's the 5 best games from that match. And I'll see you in the next video.